Hello, and welcome to the Future Christian Podcast, your source for insights and ideas into what it means to live as a follower of Jesus in the 21st century. At the Future Christian Podcast, we talk to pastors, authors, and other faith leaders for helpful advice and practical wisdom to help you and your community of faith walk boldly into the future. Here's your host, Lauren Richmond Jr.
Welcome to the Future Christian Podcast. My name is Lauren Richmond Jr., and today I'm welcoming Thom Schultz to the show. Thom is an author, filmmaker, publisher, and innovator in resources for churches. He is the director of the documentary feature film When God Left the Building, which we'll be talking more about here shortly. He is the co-author, along with his wife Joani, of many books, including Why Nobody Wants to Go to Church Anymore, The One Thing, and Don't Just Teach, Reach. His blog is called Holy Soup. Thom founded the international multimedia company Group Publishing in 1974 and continues to serve as its president. Group publishes books, Bibles, and educational resources for churches and Christians around the world. All right, welcome to the show, Thom Schultz. What else would you like our listeners to know about you?
Well, in our work with Group Publishing, we serve hundreds of thousands of churches nationwide and around the world, and it helps us to keep a pulse on what's happening in the church today, because these are the people who we deal with day in and day out, and it helps us to keep that close watch. In addition, up until COVID anyway, we sponsored an event called Future of the Church. And that attracted people from around the country to come here and pause and take a look at what's happening and where we see things coming a few years out. So that has really helped us too to keep an eye on what's happening in the church. So always happy to talk about the trends and what we see happening in the church.
That's in Loveland, right?
Yep, we're in Loveland, Colorado.
Yeah, Thom and I are both Colorado residents. So I'll have to check that out if that comes back, hopefully post-COVID, right?
Yeah.
Well, share, if you would, with our listeners kind of about your faith journey, how you came to the faith, and what that looks like today.
Since we do a lot of work with children and young people, we're always encouraging them to encourage a good environment, good Christian environment for kids to grow up in, whether that's in the home or the church or wherever. And we're looking to have that faith spark start very early. And that was the case for me. I grew up in a great Christian home, and I can't remember when I did not have a faith in God, when I did not have a relationship with Jesus. It goes so far back into my childhood. My parents were very active in the church, and my dad was Sunday school teacher and president of the congregation and everything, very, very active. So my story goes back before my memory.
And how has your faith grown and evolved to today?
It continues to be an evolving story. I'd say that probably one of the different factors today, as opposed to earlier on, is encapsulated in the Mary and Martha story, where before, particularly in my work here, my focus was really on serving God and serving the church, serving other people. And in later years, as my faith has evolved and grown, I think I've switched over more to the Mary side of things, where my emphasis and my focus is really on the relationship with Jesus, even more so than being the Martha and the servant.
Yeah. Yeah, thanks for sharing that. I'm curious what faith tradition you grew up in, if you're willing to share.
I grew up in the Lutheran church.
Ah, okay. Yeah, great. And what are some spiritual practices or spiritual disciplines that you find meaningful today that sustain your faith?
Well, we at Group produced a resource called Friends of God a couple of years ago. And I was personally involved in that resource, and it's something that I think can help a lot of people. It's a discipleship experience, we call it. And When we think of discipleship, as we began to dig into that, one of the things that we noticed was in the church, when you mention that term discipleship and you ask people, how do you promote discipleship? The answer that usually comes back is, well, we have a 6-week course or we have an 8-week Bible study.
Mm-hmm.
And we quickly determined, that's not really producing the results we want. Even when we ask those same people, how's it going? How would you say your discipleship is working and growing in your church? And the vast majority of them say, well, not too good.
Yeah.
So obviously that's not working. So we switched and really focused on the relationship with Christ. It comes out of Jesus' quote of, I no longer call you servants, I call you friends.
Mm-hmm.
Well, if that's what he called his disciples, how can we develop that in other people? So that then involves a whole different set of spiritual practices.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas before we might have thought, well, I need to accumulate more knowledge. I need to learn more Bible facts. I need to go to one more Bible study. And the answer, I think, is more in how do we develop a deeper relationship, a real relationship, not an academic relationship, but a real relationship with God. So one of the things that we do in that resource, I think will get at your question. We ask people to imagine Jesus sitting in the room with you. Look at a chair. Imagine Jesus in that chair. Observe what he's wearing. Observe how he's acting and responding, and if he's leaning forward in his chair or whatever. Just imagine Jesus sitting there right beside you. And now engage in a conversation. Forget what you've been told about what prayer is. Engage in a conversation with Jesus. That for me has been a spiritual practice that has changed my faith life in seeing Jesus in that way as a friend.
That's great. Thanks for sharing that. Well, I wanted to have Thom on to talk about a movie or a film, I should say, I guess, that Group Publishing produced a few years back. And technically, I think the film came out in 2014, but it seems like, just even watching the trailer again yesterday, it seems like it could come out next month and still be just as timely and just as relevant. The film is When God Left a Building. I'll have to provide a link in the show notes for those who want to find it online. It's still out there, still available for DVD and then for showing to a church or a group. But if you would, Thom, kind of talk about how the film came to be, what inspired it, what got you passionate about it.
Well, it grew out of the research that we have been doing on the church and what's happening in the church in America of late. And we first came out with a book called Why Nobody Wants to Go to Church Anymore. And that was based around some discoveries that we made and through research of why people are moving away from the church and what we can do about that. And in the course of that, we ran across a church in upstate New York that kind of characterized what was happening in the church today. It was a fascinating look inside of that church. So we decided to document what was happening there. So we kind of got in midstream of what was happening in that particular congregation. And the story of the film is really based around the fading of the American institutional church, how it lost its significance, its prominence in the community, and really in many ways lost its way. And this church in New York went from an attendance years ago of 900 to, at that time, an attendance of around 35 or 40.
Yeah.
And that story is an intriguing one of what happened, and we follow that story in the film. In addition, another story that we follow in the film was what happened to a corporation that happened to be based near that church in Rochester, New York, and that is Kodak, the Eastman Kodak Company. That story is a fascinating story of what happened to a once giant, influential corporation and how they fell and failed. And we compared those elements of falling and failure to what was happening in the church. So the film goes back and forth between Kodak and the church to see if we can learn anything about what causes that kind of collapse. It's a fascinating look, I think.
I forgot about the Kodak aspect of the film. I'm probably just old enough to really have the cultural memory of the significance of Kodak. But for those perhaps younger or unfamiliar, I mean, would Apple be too strong of a comparison? What's the kind of cultural comparison in today's context you think would be equivalent to just how significant Kodak was?
Yeah, Apple could be a good example. I mean, Kodak was ubiquitous. Mm-hmm. Everybody used Kodak film. Everybody had a little Kodak camera. It was the basis of photography and imaging around the world. And they had held that position for years and years and years, a huge company. And then along came digital photography, quietly starting up. And Kodak made the decision at that point to not go down the digital path, but to cling to its analog, film-based, paper-based approach to photography. And we all know what happened after that fork in the road. And it's an incredible story to watch. What many people don't know, and what we showed in the film, is that Kodak itself was the inventor of digital photography. They could have had it all,
mm-hmm.
but they walked away from it, feeling that that could threaten their bread and butter of the analog approach to photography, and that's what killed them.
So, again, there's the film I think is so powerful that I really encourage folks to watch it, at least themselves. If you're a pastor, church leader, and your church is going through any kind of spiritual or growth struggles, existential struggles, right? But for me, I think what was most challenging, Thom. So in the introductory scenes, I think it is, and you can see it in the trailer too, is this kind of a church closing, and there's the auction. And the church that's closing is in the tradition that I'm ordained in, the Christian Church Disciples of Christ. One of those churches that's closing, I think, somewhere in Missouri, if I remember correctly. I'm reminded that one of the initial kind of church growth gurus, Don McGavran, was himself Disciples of Christ missionary and minister. Yet, and again, broadly speaking, no kind of church growth movement is perfect. There's challenges and distractions, perhaps, or limitations in everything. But that was a resource within the tradition that largely, broadly speaking, is kind of being ignored. And I think it kind of goes to your Kodak example, where this kind of like having the next thing, but kind of ignoring it to cling on to the past.
Yeah, I think the church has a lot of issues. There are a lot of reasons for the decline of the American church, and we dig into that in the film as well as in the book. But what's been interesting, I think, the past couple of years is what's happened through COVID. And when we take a look at where the church is today, we might blame some of the problems or all of the problems on what happened with COVID.
Right.
Well, COVID was simply an accelerant of what was already happening in the church. And COVID came along, and all of the factors that we talk about in the film and in the book continued to be very true during COVID times, but it was just accelerated. And the decline and loss of influence for the church has been magnified and made clearer by what we see happening with COVID.
Yeah. So you mentioned kind of the story kind of revolving around this church in upstate New York, if I remember correctly, called Park Church. And there's two things that really stood out to me from that church, and then a third, another aspect separately. But I think the most obvious one was just kind of the spiritual malaise is the word that came to mind for me. You have an interview with a former pastor, kind of questioning his faith almost completely, which again, in defense of pastors as a pastor, I mean, that happens, but I think, it can be a challenge when the spiritual leader, or at least the former leader, is completely questioning their faith. You highlight a member who's talking about being the least religious church-going person. I mean, again, I definitely proudly identify as someone who works and serves in the mainline Protestant tradition. That being said, I think there's needs to be a spiritual emphasis in churches, and then refusal, just a refusal to change. But talk first about kind of the spiritual malaise, and I'll say, this is my opinion, Tom. I don't think that's a thing that's just exclusive to mainline Protestant churches. I think we find that in all kinds of churches. So talk about that.
Absolutely right. Yeah, just picking up on that, many people, especially when this became broadly noticed, this decline of the American church, many people said well, this is a mainline problem. It's not a particular problem within a particular branch of the Christian church in America. This goes across the board, and the problems, the symptoms, and what's wrong, those factors go across the board. So you're absolutely right. At this church in upstate New York, Park Church, yes, there was this malaise that had crept in over decades, really, and it was sad to see. You could even see it in the architecture of what used to be, and the people who were accommodated in the past, and now what it's shrunk to. But I think what's at the core of that is the church simply lost its way, its focus, its reason for being. We dig into that in the film, and here's where there's this comparison with Kodak. Kodak had the same problem. They didn't remember what business they were in.
Yeah,
and that's what eventually killed them. And this church didn't remember what business they were in, why they existed, how you would even define their church, or what a church is, or what that church is. They had lost track of that. In the film, there's a segment that I love, where the pastor of that church, when I asked him, well, what's the mission of your church? He couldn't remember. He kept trying to think of a couple of phrases, a couple of keywords out of it, and he couldn't remember the mission of their church.
Yeah, I mean, I sometimes think that people who can just rattle off their mission statement may be a little bit too canned, but I think broadly speaking, we'd agree. We'd like our members, at least folks who are highly vested, to have some sense of what we're about, right? And I love the Kodak analogy, because I don't remember if it was the CEO or one of the former execs you were interviewing, but they talk about, he was basically saying we weren't sure if we were a chemical company, were we a film company, we're a photography company. And I think, again, in my perspective, I think this can happen to really any kind of organization, but especially churches when and they get distracted. Are we a nonprofit seeking to do social good? Are we a religious organization? Are we a growth at all costs organization? What are we about?
Exactly right. And today, even when you ask people outside the church, what is the church? The answer that you get from people both inside the church and outside the church, what is church? The most common answer that you get, the most honest answer that you get, is it's an event. It's a weekly event on Sunday morning. That's what church is.
Yeah.
And that is basically where the church has gone off the rails in this country.
Yeah. Another aspect highlighted by the Park Church, or perhaps lowlighted by the Park Church, was just kind of this refusal to change. And when I first watched that as a pastor of a smaller church, but also very similar in their kind of stubbornness, I just felt so bad for that pastor. But I wonder, that kind of refusal to change. What do you do with that? Do you know what I'm saying?
That too was very emblematic of what happened to Kodak.
Mm-hmm.
There was a refusal to change. We tell the story in the film about this engineer who's featured in the film who actually invented the digital camera. And he talks about how he introduced this to the executives, the digital camera, his basic prototype model, and how they saw it. They saw the potential for it, but they said, no, put it away because it threatens too much their legacy business.
Yeah.
And that is what's going on in the church as well. That's what's at the core of this fear of change is, well, we'll lose what we have built up for so many years. If we make these changes, we're going to lose some people because they won't like it. That's what they're used to, is the old way. So this fear of losing part of the status quo paralyzes people to make necessary change.
Are you familiar? Hopefully, I'm remembering it correctly. The Shirky Principle, basically, this idea that all organizations really just exist, like their most basic purpose is just to help it's actually, I'm saying it wrong. It's to create the problem that keeps them in existence. So, but there's certainly this similar aspect of organizations' kind of underlying existence is basically just to perpetuate their own existence, right?
Yeah. Yeah, I think that tells a story too of what's happening in the church.
Yeah. One other thing, now, this didn't come from the Park Church per se, but I think you highlight like a police officer in the film, and he says something like, "I just can't bring my friends to work, or excuse me, to church," and I think that's challenging because this is something you kind of highlight in the film. Like, church has become, in some aspect, incredibly seeker sensitive, but in other ways, there's such an in culture or a different, almost countercultural context that the police officer felt like there was no way to translate, like, hey, come to my church and you'll fit in and understand what's happening. And I think that's especially challenging today, in my opinion, for many traditional worship churches where it's just a complete different countercultural thing. Talk more about that.
Yeah, I think there's two things happening there. One is a church the place where a non-church person would want to come?
Mm-hmm.
And then there's the other factor of, well, once there, is there something there that actually pulls them in or pushes them away?
Yeah.
And to the first, it seems less and less draw for people to the church. The product that's being presented, and it's wrapped in this idea of this weekly event.
Mm-hmm.
If that's what we're drawing people to, and believe me, in our work, we run into this every day, where the focus, the scorecard, everything is focused on that weekly event.
Yeah.
And what your numbers were
Mm-hmm.
coming out of that weekly event. Well, that weekly event in a place, no matter what you do with it, is no longer the attractant that it might have been to people generations ago. So that simply isn't working like it might have in the past. And then once people get there, what do they feel? What do they experience? And that we've done a lot of study on as well. And by far, the number one reaction that people have, and the number one reason that people cite that they may leave or they may be repelled by the church, is a sense of being judged.
Mm.
That comes across in indelible ways.
Mm-hmm.
And again, since COVID, you might think that, well, maybe that's kind of softened, but no, it's been exacerbated. And some of that exacerbation has come from what's happening culturally around us, because this whole idea of judgment, of judging the other side, or judging people or an individual, as we know, in our culture, in politics, in society, whether it's with culture wars or whatever, the idea of judging someone else, of taking this moral supremacy over someone, that that's on steroids today, and the church has been sucked right into it, and it's repelling people.
Yeah. I wonder, Tom, do you think in some ways there's been, I've been reading about and talking to other pastors about how, through COVID, there's kind of been this forced kind of diluting of things the church is doing. Like, do you think, in some ways there's almost been getting back to basics? Do you think COVID represents, coming out of COVID or whatever this post-COVID, thing is going to be here with the virus? Do you think it represents, like, can it be potentially a good thing where churches can kind of like let go of things that they're doing that are not helpful, and kind of refocus and reframe?
Well, yes, I think that opportunity is there, and I think that there is a great opportunity that has come out of COVID for us in the church to reevaluate everything that we're doing, and reevaluate who we are, and to, in a sense, start over. It presents a tremendous opportunity to ask those questions and to do some things that might have been harder to do a few years ago. However, the reaction that many churches have taken to COVID has been
double down
disappointing to me. Yeah, doubling down on that. And what I've described as this weekly spectator event. When COVID came, there were so many churches that immediately, knee-jerk, jumped into, well, that is our focus. That's what we do. That's what the church is a weekly spectator event. How can we transform that into something that can, if they've locked our doors and we can't have people come to our physical location, how can we transform that weekly spectator event to an online event? So that's what everybody did, and they jumped into that, some better than others. And yes, there were some who were inclined to a passive experience. They tuned in for a passive online experience. But there were others who understood that the true church is a relational thing, and their relational heart for what church meant to them was gone, and it was substituted with this simply more spectator approach. Those people, many of them have not returned because they drifted away during that time because the church, even its online iteration, did not satisfy what their longing was, being a relational collection of believers.
Yeah. Well, I really want to encourage folks to check out the film. If we haven't whetted your taste enough, your interest about, and it is definitely a discouraging film. I think I want to say, but there are some signs of hope in the film. That's what I'd also like to highlight. I think one thing that I'm curious about is, I think, what was it in Dallas, if I remember correctly, where you highlight like this kind of like group of believers that met like an apartment building. Can you talk more about that example?
Yeah, it's the story of an organization called Mission Arlington.
Okay.
So it's in Arlington, Texas, kind of in the Dallas-Fort Worth area. And this ministry started, it's like 35 years ago. And the leader still today is a woman named Tilly Bergen. And she's like 86, I think, today.
Wow.
And she continues on, and it's an incredible ministry. They have taken the approach of ministering to people no matter what their needs are across the metro area. And in terms of gathering, their gathering is in over 350 locations around the metro area, mostly in homes or community centers or whatever. It's primarily lay-led in these gatherings, but the people know one another. They're accountable to one another. They love one another. They keep track of one another. And that is, it's one of the largest churches in America that no one realizes.
Right.
Thousands and thousands of people every week. But I think they've found some ways to approach church and ways of defining what church is that are inspiring.
Yeah, yeah. Another example that I think comes from y'all at group is the Life Tree Cafe. I've done this a little bit in some context. Talk more about that and kind of, what's the kind of philosophy behind that?
Life Tree Cafe it came about over 10 years ago now as an outreach to the community, especially for people who may not be the type of person who is likely to enter into a church or a church service. And Life Tree Cafe brings up current stories, current things that people are dealing with, and through video vignettes and so on, helps people to find a Christian approach to these things that come at us in life. And it's designed to happen in small settings. Picture a setting that feels like a Starbucks, where people can sit around small tables and talk about these things that matter. And there is a live person who directs the hour. It's an hour-long experience, and throws some questions out to people to talk about at their table. So it's highly relational and highly individualized to what's happening with those people at that table, and brings them around to focus on, well, what might God have to say about these things that we see happening around us? And it's been an incredible journey and experience for us to watch what has happened with that through the years. We've often said around here at group that it was another one of the ideas that we've had, which there have been many, that we felt we've been ahead of our time.
Yeah.
And Life Tree Cafe had that originally come out right before COVID. That probably would have been just the perfect timing for it.
Yeah, it's funny. I thought the same thing, Tom. You thinking about this, your film, if it came out 6-7 years later, it'd be all over social media. But I think what these examples kind of highlight, if I'm hearing correctly, is kind of 3 principles that I think can be thought about and put into practice: relationality, interactiveness, and then kind of relevant. And I kind of contrast that to kind of what you're talking about with this kind of really just observing and watching kind of a church context. Do you think that kind of those 3 principles in a smaller nature is really kind of a future path for church?
Yeah, I think you've nailed it. We use an acronym around here called REAL, REAL, and the R is relational. Our approach to ministry has to be relational, and that relational comes down to person, one-on-one kind of relational. The E stands for experiential, that it's more important and more impactful when we do rather than simply passively watch or listen. The A is applicable. Another way of saying that is relevance, that it's got to deal with things that I'm dealing with in my own life right now in order for it to be impactful. And the L is learner-based and lifelong. By that we mean that we're not basing a ministry around the interests or giftedness of the teacher or preacher. We're basing it around how the learner is wired.
Well, as professional clergy, I guess I'm kind of mixed feelings on all that. But it does seem like more and more I know in many mainline circles we talk about how it seems like the age of the kind of professional clergy seems to be nearing an end. And certainly if we think about these models of smaller churches, house churches that around, if you understand the term lay leadership, seems to be a future, yeah?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's one of the trends that we'll see is lay leadership, if not bivocational leadership. And that, again, when you take a look at that example that we talked about earlier from Arlington, Texas, that's one of their keys. And they work a lot on training those lay leaders. And I think we're entering into a time where we're switching the focus from this weekly event focus, which within that, the major focus there, the major investment of time and attention there is on what? The sermon.
Mm-hmm.
And so your lead pastor, your teaching pastor, your senior pastor spends, in many cases, the majority of their time on that speech. So we're switching from that dedication from that to how can I train, equip, and nurture these lay people who are doing the real ministry, one-on-one, relationally. So my time is much better invested equipping, training, nurturing them than it is in preparing a stage presentation.
Yeah. I think about it this way, Tom, like in the Catholic Church, there's 7 sacraments, right? And I couldn't name them all off the top of my head. And certainly in Protestant churches, at least most Protestant churches wouldn't use the term sacrament, ordinance, whatever. Some churches call them different things, but traditionally it's like baptism and Lord's Supper, right? It's been my observation, at least, that in many evangelicalist churches, like the 2 sacraments, so to speak, is the sermon, like you said, and then like the musical worship, right? And what's interesting is, at least as I have observed it, when they do have a baptism or take communion, it's almost like an awkward, like we don't know where to fit this in. So I think I appreciate what you're saying there about a refocusing of like what is really the most vital thing here. Is it the 20, 30, 40 minute sermon or message or talk, or is it investing in relationship building and mentoring and discipling?
Mm-hmm. The discipleship minister at our church came by. He's fairly new, and he came by and visited my wife and I here in our office a couple of weeks ago. And he asked an interesting question. He said, well, what do you think I should be focusing my time on? What's going to be most effective as the discipleship pastor to do? And my immediate answer to his question was, do this. Do this more. Come visit your people and have a conversation, have a friendly conversation on their turf. That's one of the best things you can do to promote discipleship.
On their turf. Yeah, writing that down there, on their turf. I think that's a great way to say it. Well, before we take a break, let me ask you 2 more questions. One is, I think since the film came out, I've kind of checked up on the Park Church in New York a couple of times just to kind of see what's happened. It seemed like after the film came out, there was some like revitalization efforts, and just looking the other day, it seemed like it was kind of like, So, I mean, I don't know what you want to say about that. I don't want to say maybe, I don't know, thoughts about churches trying to go through a revitalization effort, in lieu of Park Church.
They've tried a lot of different things. First of all, the pastor featured in the film, Christy Wareham. I don't want to give too much away of what happens to him during the filming, but right now, just heard from him a couple of days ago. He has now taken on a new assignment with the Peace Corps in Morocco. So that's where Christy is. When you take a look at what's happened to Park Church since then, they've gone through a number of pastors, leaders. They now currently have an interim pastor there once again. And I looked in just in the past week to the recording of their service on YouTube, and you can look back through the past few Sundays, and what you can see, looking from where the camera is at the back of the sanctuary, which takes a pretty good wide view of the space there. It's typically 6 to 8 people who are in attendance on a Sunday morning. And they recently reported, as of the beginning of this year, that they had 34 members, who they called pledging members, at this point pledging a total of about $50,000 a year, and their expenses are 4 times that. So they seem to continue to struggle.
Yeah. So, I mean, perhaps a fair word of warning that, there sometimes change doesn't always work, I guess, right? Some communities, I don't know if you'd agree with this, Tom. Another leader I had on the podcast suggested something to the point that, some churches they need to die for new life to happen. Is that fair?
Yeah, I think so. I think that's probably true of any institution, any organization that for some, there comes a point where the best thing you can do is to let something die. That's certainly true with churches, and many are dying, dissolving, being combined in with other churches, and so on. And that's not it's not all bad in the big scheme of things, right, of what the church is and where the church needs to go.
Well, you've been in Christian ministry, working with a lot of leaders for a long time. Do you have any quick advice for pastors and leaders, going forward here?
As I look forward, many people, even when we were going around the country in theaters showing the film, we'd have a question and answer time afterwards, and a common question from people was, well, what do you see for the future? Do you have hope for the church? And my answer was, well, I don't have a lot of hope for what the church is today surviving into tomorrow.
Mm-hmm.
I do have a lot of hope and enthusiasm for what the church can become and transition into. And I feel honored and blessed to be here on this earth during a time when there is such a great transition happening. And I think God's hand is in this transition, and God is leading us into something new and different. And we have to have the courage and the openness and the willingness to follow that direction into the future. I think as we look to the future, the key is to look at it with fresh eyes, not simply how do we fix this thing that's kind of broken, but how do we, in effect, start over? If we could start over today, what would that look like? What would the church be? And I think that's going to require encouraging a different breed of leader. It's going to take a different type of person to lead us in the future. The old styles and types of leader and leadership that have worked for the church in the past are not going to be those that will work for us in the future. So what do I mean by that? What is a profile of that future-oriented leader? And I think it's touching on some of the things we've talked about already today of being a true disciple maker, understanding what a disciple is and what discipleship is. It's going to take someone who I would call a relational architect, somebody who's really good at that, of relationships. It's going to take someone who's a conversation artist, somebody who really knows the art of conversation and can promote that within a congregation. It's going to be somebody who is a friend maker, who really understands friendship and how to process that. That's different from some of what we've seen in the past. I remember we had a conference here at Group some years ago, and there was a pastor from across the country who was here, and we got into talking about friendship, and we asked the question of him, do you have close friendships, either within or outside of the congregation? And his immediate answer was no. Friendship is just a constant stream of paper cuts.
Wow.
And that's not the kind of leader that we need for tomorrow. We need somebody who is a friend maker,
right,
and a matchmaker. Somebody who can knows how to put two people together. I'm not talking about romantic matching. I'm just talking about friend matching. Somebody who knows how to put that together. Hey, I want to introduce you to somebody who I think you'd really click with. That's the kind of skill we need in the leader of tomorrow. And lastly, I'd say this leader needs to be a great, tremendous listener.
Yeah. People want to be heard. Let's take a quick break, come back with some closing questions. Again, the film is When God Left the Building. We didn't even get a chance to talk about the book. There's the book, Why Nobody Wants to Go to Church. I think you have like a discussion resource with that, if I remember correctly, right? I've gone through. So let's take a break and we'll come back with some closing questions. All right, we're back with Thom Schultz. Thom, thanks so much for your time. Appreciate the conversation and your insights. You can take these closing questions as seriously or not as you'd like to. But if you're Pope for a day, what would you like to do with that day?
I think I'd be interested in encouraging and pushing those of us in the church, both leaders and lay people, to start afresh, to imagine what the church can and should be, to redefine or to reclaim the original definition of what the church is, and then to figure out how to go after that and to build that into the future.
A theologian or historical Christian figure you'd want to meet or bring back to life?
I'm always drawn to the character of Peter, who was such a regular guy. I can imagine him putting his foot in his mouth more than once, but he had this God-inspired, risk-taking ability to take great risks on behalf of the Lord. And he, in ways more so than some of the others, I think, was a permanent world changer from his approach. So I admire him, and I look forward in eternity to meeting him and hearing his stories.
He's got plenty of time to tell them, that's for sure. What do you think history will remember from our current time and place?
Current time and place, I think we're coming through this huge worldwide event of COVID, which affected the world in so many ways and also affected the church in profound ways. There have been people who have observed that in culture at large, but particularly in the church or in the spiritual world, that there are world events, certain things that happen that you can look back and see that those things tend to occur about every 500 years.
Yeah.
And we were due.
Yeah.
I mean, the last big shakeup in the church was the Reformation. And that was 500 years ago. And so those of us who have been kind of waiting and watching when COVID came along, in some ways it was no surprise, because it was 500 years after that event that this earth-shaking event of COVID came about. And it has already caused some big changes in the church. But I think when people look back today, they're going to say, well, that was the time that the church really changed into something new and different. And one of the leading sparks for that was COVID.
Yeah. Reminds me of a unfortunately, she's no longer with us, but Phil Stickle, who you have as a what's the word I'm looking for? Credit. What, I can't think of the word. But talking good about the film. Unfortunately, she's passed, but she's done a lot of work on that whole kind of 500-year thing.
Yeah.
You talked a little about your hopes for the future. Do you have anything else you want to share there?
One of the things that we've touched on that I would characterize as a hope, and that is that we understand that bigger is not the goal, and that as we look to the future, the benefits and the outcomes that we can have being smaller as a community of believers, that we are gathering in smaller units, is something that I'm hopeful for and is to be celebrated. And I think that's something that can give hope to many in the church today who have felt intimidated by the flashy so-called success of the megachurch. And I think hope needs to be given and encouraged to those who have simply been good shepherds along with their smaller flocks through the years, that it is being revealed now and will be revealed more in the future, that being a shepherd of a smaller, manageable flock is a strength.
Those are good words to leave with pastors. I appreciate that. I'll make sure to include some links in the show notes for the film. Where else can people find out about you and connect with you?
Yeah, the film, by the way, you can get the DVD through Amazon, as well as you can rent the film and watch it through Amazon as well. And people can find out more about me at group.com. Just group.com, you'll find out more about what we do and our work, as well as my blog, which is called holysoup.com.
Great. Well, Thom, I really appreciate your time. Really enjoyed the conversation. I always leave folks with a word of peace, so may God's peace be with you.
Thank you.
Thanks for joining us on the Future Christian Podcast. To learn more about Lauren or the podcast, visit future-christian.com. One more thing before you go. Do us a favor and subscribe to the podcast. And if you're feeling especially generous, leave a review. It really helps us get the word out to more people about the podcast. The Future Christian Podcast is a production of Torn Curtain Arts and Resonate Media. Our episodes were mixed by Danny Burton, and the production support is provided by Paul Romig-Levitt. Thanks, and go in peace.